The jungle was silent now. Only the low hiss of rain through the palm leaves broke the stillness over the captured ridge on Saipan, 1944. The smell of smoke and spent gunpowder still lingered. Japanese Marines, thin from weeks of fighting, moved cautiously through the abandoned American camp, their rifles low, eyes scanning for movement. What they found was not a battlefield, but a mystery. Inside a half-buried crate lay tins of butter, steak strips, and powdered ice cream mix. Nearby, a small generator hummed beside a steel chest, a portable refrigerator. A few meters away, an overturned table still held a half-eaten plate, untouched as if time had stopped mid-meal. One soldier knelt, staring at the can labels printed in clean English, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. He muttered, "They eat like kings." For men who'd survived on rice balls and rainwater, it was more than food. It was proof of something larger. Proof that this enemy was not starving. He was thriving. And that realization changed everything. Long before the Pacific turned red with war, Japan had built its armies not on abundance, but on endurance. From the earliest days of its modernization, the Imperial Japanese military taught that victory belonged to the spirit, not to material comfort. The concept of seishin, the purity of one's fighting spirit, stood above all else. Officers were trained to believe that the will to suffer, to fight hungry, tired, and wounded, was proof of moral superiority. The soldier who could endure hunger was, in their eyes, already stronger than the one who could not. By 1941, when Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to the Philippines, this belief had hardened into doctrine. Training camps across Kyushu and Hokkaido drilled young recruits not only in weapons and tactics, but in deprivation itself. Meals were sparse, bowls of rice, pickled radish, and sometimes fish. Drill instructors often withheld food to strengthen discipline, forcing men to conquer the stomach before conquering the enemy. To them, comfort was corruption. Endurance was honor. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, many senior officers viewed America through that same lens of contempt. They saw a nation of consumers, soft, indulgent, and incapable of surviving hardship. Japanese war planners believed the Americans might fight bravely at first, but would crumble once the war demanded real suffering. The early victories seemed to prove them right. From the Philippines to Singapore, Japanese troops stormed positions held by Allied soldiers who lacked supplies or coordination. In Bataan, American and Filipino forces fell back under starvation and disease. Reports reached Tokyo of enemy soldiers begging for food. To the Japanese high command, this was confirmation. The Americans were weak. They might have machines, but no stomach for endurance. Yet beneath that arrogance was an unseen weakness of their own. Because Japan's logistical system was fragile, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Its merchant fleet was limited, its tankers vulnerable, its supply doctrine rooted in land-based thinking. The Imperial Navy was designed for battle, not for sustaining armies across island jungles. When the Pacific War expanded, Japan's soldiers often found themselves isolated on faraway islands, left to survive on whatever could be shipped or scavenged. Supply lines collapsed under the strain. Ships sunk by American submarines meant that food, ammunition, and medicine often never arrived. By late 1942, entire garrisons were living on starvation rations, foraging jungle roots, even consuming insects to stay alive. Still, they fought, and believed their suffering was proof of honor. A Japanese soldier's pride was not in what he ate, but in what he could do without. That mindset, forged in hardship and reinforced by propaganda, made them formidable foes, but also blinded them to a coming reality, because while Japan's armies worshipped endurance, their enemy was building something far more powerful, not in spirit, but in structure. Across the Pacific, the United States was assembling a war machine unlike anything the world had seen, one that could feed, fuel, and move entire armies across oceans, without hunger, without pause. The next section will shift to that other side, how a nation of factories and farmers transformed supply into a weapon as decisive as any bomb or battleship. In 1942, while Japanese soldiers tightened their belts in jungle outposts, American engineers were tightening bolts in factories, millions of them. The United States had entered the war with the same fury it had once reserved for industry itself. The lesson of the Great Depression had been clear. Productivity could move mountains. Now that same machinery was harnessed for war. By the time U.S. forces landed on Guadalcanal, supply was strategy. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, often invisible in stories of valor, became one of the most powerful arms of the military. Its job was not to fight, but to ensure that those who did never lacked food, fuel, or comfort. The quartermaster's philosophy was simple but revolutionary. A soldier who eats well fights well. Factories from Chicago to Pittsburgh converted to produce tins, cans, and dehydrated meals by the millions. Cattle from Kansas, corn from Iowa, milk from Wisconsin, all were turned into compact rations designed to last months under tropical heat. The sea ration was born, a can of fortified food that could survive saltwater, humidity, and jungle rot. It wasn't gourmet, but it was dependable. Later came the K ration, designed by physiologist Ansel Keys, a self-contained meal kit that fit into a soldier's pocket. Each box carried breakfast, dinner, and supper, providing 3,000 calories a day. In every crate, the Americans packed not just sustenance but morale. While Japanese soldiers boiled muddy rice or hunted wild roots, U.S. troops could open cans of meat, biscuits, coffee, and even chocolate. Each spoonful was a taste of home, and a reminder of the industrial strength behind them. But America didn't stop at survival. It pursued comfort. In 1943, the Navy's Bureau of Supplies and Accounts began converting old freighters into floating kitchens. Massive ships equipped to bake bread, roast meat, and send hot meals to troops fighting on nearby islands. Others carried frozen food in refrigerated holds, powered by diesel generators and insulated chambers. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had even commissioned ice cream barges, floating factories capable of producing hundreds of gallons a day. They were sent across the Pacific to keep sailors' morale high during the endless months at sea. To the enemy, this sounded absurd, but to American command, it was genius. Every bite of ice cream was proof of reach, power, and permanence. Behind the scenes, logistics was becoming warfare itself. The U.S. built over 3,000 Liberty ships, each capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies. Convoys stretched from California to Australia, from Hawaii to the Marianas, like steel arteries feeding the lifeblood of the Pacific Front. Where Japan's army relied on improvisation, America relied on system. Each division had a pre-planned chain: ships to ports, ports to depots, depots to field kitchens. Fuel, ammunition, and rations all flowed in sync. It was not glamorous, but it was relentless. For every man holding a rifle in the jungle, there were 10 behind him. Cooks, mechanics, transport officers, engineers, ensuring he never went hungry or dry. It was a victory of organization as much as courage. As American troops advanced island by island, they brought their kitchens with them. Steel drums became ovens, jeeps became food carriers, and aircraft dropped ration crates by parachute into combat zones. Even in the chaos of battle, the U.S. soldier could expect a hot meal within reach. This abundance wasn't arrogance. It was deliberate psychology. Commanders knew that soldiers fighting thousands of miles from home needed more than bullets. They needed reminders of civilization, a cup of coffee before dawn, a warm plate after battle, or a scoop of ice cream on a tropical night. To their Japanese counterparts, such indulgence seemed impossible, even dishonorable. But to the Americans, it was morale, and morale was survival. That contrast between starvation and sufficiency, between endurance and efficiency, would soon erupt in the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, where one side fought to endure and the other fought to sustain. As the war turned toward Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the first shocking encounters would unfold. Moments when Japanese soldiers, expecting emaciated enemies, instead faced men laughing, eating, and fighting with energy to spare. War at its core is not just fought with bullets. It's fought with belief. And in the Pacific, the greatest illusion was that one side's hunger meant weakness, while the other's abundance meant softness. For the Japanese soldier, hunger was an old companion. From boot camp to battlefield, deprivation was ritualized. A man who could fight on an empty stomach proved his loyalty to the emperor. Instructors told recruits, "A true warrior eats once a day but fights all day." This belief carried men through endless campaigns, from the jungles of New Guinea to the coral sands of Tarawa. It was pride through pain, but pride can turn to blindness. When Japanese troops first met American forces in full strength, they were stunned not by technology, but by energy. The Americans didn't look weary. They looked fed. And that changed everything. Prisoners of war later recalled the disbelief. On Guadalcanal, one captured Marine reported that his Japanese guards whispered among themselves, astonished that his rations included meat, fruit, and chocolate. One of them said quietly, "You Americans live as if you are home." To the Japanese, this was impossible. How could a man fight so far from home and still eat like he was in New York or Chicago? How could he carry ice cream into a jungle where they could barely find water? That perception, that the Americans were never truly suffering, became a psychological weight on Japanese morale. They had been taught that the enemy would crumble under hardship, yet here he was, laughing, rested, with full bellies and clean uniforms. To many Japanese soldiers, this was more than a defeat of body, it was a defeat of spirit. Meanwhile, for American troops, food was more than sustenance, it was a threat of home. In a war fought thousands of miles from everything familiar, every ration box carried emotional power. A tin of peaches was summer in a can. A cup of hot coffee was civilization against chaos. A spoon of chocolate was proof that life still existed beyond the gunfire. Commanders understood this deeply. U.S. Army psychologist reports from 1943 described rations as emotional stabilizers. They noticed that soldiers with regular good meals showed higher morale, fewer breakdowns, and stronger combat performance. Food, it turned out, was not a luxury. It was a weaponized form of stability. That difference in mindset, endurance versus morale, mirrored the societies behind the armies. Japan's war culture was rooted in sacrifice, austerity, and spiritual purity. America's was rooted in production, comfort, and abundance. Both were forms of strength, but only one could sustain itself indefinitely. On islands where starvation and sickness often decided battles long before bullets did, this mattered more than courage. The Japanese soldier could endure anything, but not forever. The American soldier didn't need to. Every supply crate that landed on a Pacific beach was a quiet declaration. We are not here to survive. We are here to stay. And as those crates multiplied, a strange reversal began to occur. Japanese troops, once proud of their hunger, started to see it as a curse. Captured diaries revealed envy and disbelief. One officer on Bougainville wrote, "We live like ghosts, but the Americans feast every night. Their gods must be powerful." The truth was simpler. Their gods were factories. That realization struck deeper than any artillery shell, because once an enemy begins to admire the very thing he despised, comfort, abundance, and the will to maintain it, the war of spirit begins to shift. Every great war reveals not only the strength of armies, but the ingenuity of their engineers. In the Pacific, where jungles devoured machinery and salt air corroded everything, the American answer was innovation at scale. The U.S. military approached food the same way it approached weapons, with science. The Quartermaster Corps worked, hand in hand with industrial chemists, packaging experts, and refrigeration engineers to redesign how a soldier ate. By 1943, what had once been a humble kitchen operation had evolved into a sprawling network of laboratories and factories. Food wasn't just cooked, it was engineered. Nutritional scientists studied calorie needs in heat, humidity, and combat stress. They measured the shelf life of canned meat, tested salt content, even examined how the color and texture of food affected morale. Every variable mattered, because the battlefield no longer had kitchens, it had supply chains. At the heart of it all stood a remarkable technological leap: portable refrigeration. The U.S. Navy and quartermaster teams created compact, diesel-powered cooling units that could fit inside tents, ships, or field trucks. These mobile chillers kept meat and dairy products safe in climates where bacteria thrived. It was a triumph of applied science, allowing soldiers to enjoy fresh or frozen food thousands of miles from the nearest city. And then there were the ships, floating miracles of logistics. By 1944, the Navy had begun deploying what sailors fondly called ice cream ships. The first of them, the USS Ice Cream Barge No. 1, was stationed near the Marshall Islands. It could produce over 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, more than 500 gallons a day. The output was distributed to nearby vessels and forward bases, ensuring every sailor could enjoy a cold dessert under a tropical sun. To the Japanese, this seemed almost mythical. Intelligence reports described American logistics as limitless. Captured officers on Saipan later wrote that their men could not comprehend how an army in such conditions could eat like that. But the secret wasn't mystery, it was infrastructure. Every meal depended on a meticulously coordinated ballet of ships, ports, and people. Liberty ships carried the bulk cargo, canned goods, flour, coffee, milk powder. Victory ships followed, faster and more specialized, hauling refrigerated stores. At sea, oilers refueled them mid-voyage, keeping the food chain alive across thousands of miles of open water. On land, CBs, the Navy's construction battalions, became unsung heroes. They built kitchens from corrugated metal, ovens from fuel drums, and cold rooms from salvaged insulation. In less than a week, a deserted atoll could host a functioning mess hall capable of feeding thousands. Behind every bite of steak or scoop of ice cream was a mountain of engineering: diesel generators, ammonia coolants, sealed containers, precision-timed convoys, and coded shipping manifests that ensured the right food reached the right front at the right time. Even the rations themselves evolved with science. Dehydration techniques, improved can linings, and vacuum sealing allowed food to last months without spoiling. Powdered milk, fruit juice crystals, and instant coffee became daily staples, small miracles in tins and packets. For soldiers who had grown up in the Great Depression, this abundance in the field was nothing short of astonishing. The U.S. government didn't just feed an army, it industrialized sustenance. Factories in Illinois and Pennsylvania churned out millions of ration kits weekly. Rail lines carried them to ports where cranes loaded the supplies into waiting ships with mathematical precision. It was the first time in history that logistics itself became a weaponized force, as vital as air superiority or artillery. To the men fighting on those islands, this system translated into something simple: reliability. No matter how remote the battlefield, there would be food. No matter how fierce the fight, the supply ships would come. This certainty bred confidence, a quiet psychological edge that technology had made possible. While the Japanese soldier fought to endure, the American soldier fought knowing that behind him stood an entire nation's industrial genius, humming, building, feeding. That difference, invisible yet immense, would soon show its true impact on the battlefield. Because as the Americans landed on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, their logistical empire moved with them, turning every beachhead into a self-sustaining outpost of civilization. The Pacific sun was merciless over Guadalcanal, August 1942. Humidity turned the air thick and heavy. The jungle buzzed with insects and the beaches reeked of rot and smoke. Here, for the first time, Japanese ground troops met the full measure of the U.S. war machine. Not in a naval duel, but in the daily grind of survival. The Japanese had expected to starve the enemy out. Their command believed the American Marines, isolated and undersupplied, would soon surrender or perish. Tokyo's newspapers even announced that the Yankees will rot on the beaches. But reality unfolded differently. When U.S. forces seized Henderson Field and dug in, the Japanese began a relentless campaign to retake it. Their troops marched through steaming jungles with sacks of rice and dried fish, often carrying no more than 2 days' food. When supplies ran out, they scoured the terrain for roots or coconuts. Hunger was constant, accepted as normal. And yet every time they breached American lines, they found the unthinkable. Abandoned foxholes filled with empty cans labeled U.S. Army, beef with vegetables, coffee, instant, fruit cocktail. Field stoves with half-burned rations still simmering. In one captured position, a Japanese officer reportedly found a box of cigarettes, soap, and canned peaches. He later wrote in his diary, "The enemy lives in abundance. They eat well, they smoke, they laugh. Their strength is strange. It does not fade." That observation spread through the ranks like rumor and myth. Many Japanese soldiers had begun the war believing the Americans could not fight without comfort, that a few weeks of hardship would break them. But on Guadalcanal it was the Japanese who weakened first. The U.S. Navy's logistical lifeline, though strained and often under fire, never broke. Cargo ships slipped through by night, unloading crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Even as the Japanese fleet prowled nearby, the Americans found ways to keep their men fed. Hot meals, canned fruit, and coffee were delivered under fire. For Japanese troops, whose supply convoys were shredded by Allied aircraft and submarines, the contrast was unbearable. They called their own resupply runs rat transportation, desperate night missions that rarely brought enough to feed a single regiment. On average, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal consumed less than 1,000 calories per day. Diseases like dysentery and malaria spread faster than bullets. By winter, men were collapsing not from wounds but from exhaustion and hunger. Meanwhile, American Marines, though battered and sleep-deprived, remained physically strong. They had energy. Their weapons were maintained, their wounds cleaned, their bellies full enough to fight again each dawn. Each supply drop from the sky or landing craft restored not just nourishment, but morale. Guadalcanal became a mirror, one army starving for honor, the other thriving through organization. By the battle's end in early 1943, Japan had lost more men to hunger and disease than to direct combat. They left behind diaries filled with disbelief and bitterness. One note, found on a fallen officer, read simply, "We are skeletons. The Americans feast as they kill us." The same revelation struck again in November 1943 on the island of Tarawa. Here, the Japanese garrison of roughly 4,800 men fortified the coral atoll, confident that the American invaders would die on the reefs, far from resupply exposed under the sun. Instead, within 76 hours, Tarawa fell. The Americans lost over 1,000 men, but what shocked the Japanese survivors was not the victory itself, but what came afterward. In the captured camps, they saw a familiar sight: American field kitchens roaring to life almost immediately. The smoke of battle hadn't cleared, and already mess tents rose on the sand. Marines were eating warm rations, passing coffee, sharing cigarettes. The war machine didn't pause to celebrate or mourn. It simply continued functioning. To the Japanese prisoners still hungry and delirious, it looked almost surreal. How could an army that had just crossed the Pacific, stormed beaches under fire, and buried its dead already be boiling water for coffee? The answer was invisible. To them, the convoys, the storage ships, the Seabees, the floating depots waiting just beyond the horizon. That hidden machinery of supply was now turning every captured island into an extension of America itself, complete with ovens, refrigeration units, and rations. By the end of Tarawa, a silent truth had emerged across the Pacific. The Americans didn't conquer islands merely to plant flags. They conquered them to build kitchens. And that truth would reach its ultimate form in the final stages of the war, when the machinery of abundance reached its peak, on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where ice cream, steak, and hot bread accompanied the deadliest battles of all. By early 1945, the Pacific was burning. The tide had turned completely. From the Mariana Islands to the Philippines, Japan's outer defenses had fallen. Only two great strongholds remained, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each was a fortress of rock, and each became a stage for the final revelation of America's full industrial power. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they faced an enemy ready to die to the last man. The Japanese had spent months burrowing into volcanic tunnels, surviving on dwindling supplies. Their rice was moldy, their water rationed. Each man carried just enough food for 3 days, though they knew the battle might last weeks. American commanders, by contrast, had prepared an invasion powered by mathematics. Behind the assault waves came a fleet of over 800 ships, many of them supply and service vessels. Each division had preloaded cargo, food, ammunition, medicine, water, and even mobile bakeries. Floating depots waited offshore, capable of serving an army for months without touching land. When the landings began, chaos ruled. Beaches were torn apart by artillery, and entire supply dumps went up in flames. But within hours, logistics units, the unsung backbone of the invasion, were rebuilding order from ruin. By the third day, field kitchens were operating amid shell fire. Cooks wearing steel helmets ladled stew from steam drums while artillery thundered around them. American soldiers ate hot beef and beans only a few hundred yards from the front lines. Some sipped coffee brewed from seawater run through makeshift filters. To the starving Japanese trapped in their tunnels, the smell drifted like a cruel reminder of an impossible reality. Captured diaries from Iwo Jima later told the same story. Disbelief, envy, despair. Even under fire, they eat warm food. Their strength never fades, one surviving officer wrote. Our men chew clay to stop hunger. By the end of the battle, nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Fewer than 300 were taken alive. Among their possessions, U.S. troops found notes describing the Americans as machines that never tire, not because of courage, but because of supply. If Iwo Jima revealed America's endurance, Okinawa revealed its excess. Launched in April 1945, it was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. 500,000 men supported by a logistical system so vast it was said to have its own gravity. Here the U.S. Navy fielded everything from floating dry docks to mobile ice plants. Every fleet anchorage had refrigeration ships, bakery ships, and water distillation units. On the beaches, the Seabees laid down roads, fuel lines, and kitchens before the smoke of battle had cleared. Photographs from Okinawa show soldiers eating. From metal trays beside bulldozers, steam rising from their meals under tropical rain. The menu? Steak, mashed potatoes, canned peaches, and for dessert, ice cream, churned by diesel-powered mixers brought ashore the day before. It sounds trivial until one understands what it meant. For Japanese defenders, cut off from resupply, and living in underground caves, food had become the definition of survival. Many were reduced to eating roots and captured rations. Their morale disintegrated not only from defeat, but from the visible contrast of worlds. They saw American soldiers laughing over full plates and realized these men were not temporary invaders. They were a civilization in motion. Their empire didn't march, it sailed. And wherever it landed, it rebuilt the comforts of home. This was more than logistics. It was a message. We can project not just power, but life itself, across the ocean. For the Japanese military, it was incomprehensible. Their entire doctrine had been built on sacrifice, that the side willing to suffer more would triumph. But here the Americans had rewritten the equation. The side that could sustain itself, could fight forever. Even senior Japanese officers recognized it. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze strategy, privately admitted in May 1945 that our spirit cannot overcome their material. It was not defeat in battle that broke him. It was the realization that no amount of courage could match an enemy that never hungered. By the end of Okinawa, 12,000 Americans were dead, but the army was still being fed steak and ice cream. In contrast, 100,000 Japanese soldiers had perished, many from starvation before a bullet found them. The war had begun with Japan believing endurance was victory. It was ending with the opposite truth. Abundance was survival. And as U.S. ships filled the horizon, bringing more supplies than Japan could dream of producing, one reality became unavoidable. The empire of rice had met the empire of refrigeration. When the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa in June 1945, Japan's military command faced not just a military defeat, but a shattering revelation. The war was no longer a contest of armies. It was a contest of worlds. And one world had simply run out of food. In the aftermath of Okinawa, Allied intelligence reports began cataloging what the Japanese left behind. Rotting sacks of rice, rusted tin cans, hand-ground flour from weeds. Medical officers noted that many captured soldiers were suffering from malnutrition so severe that wounds wouldn't heal. A few had resorted to eating grass or tree bark. Their body weights averaged 35 kilograms. One American surgeon described them as Ghosts still marching. The Japanese command had watched their troops starve for years, but Okinawa made it. Undeniable. The Empire's supply system had collapsed beyond repair. Convoys were sunk faster than they could sail. Coal, steel, and rice production had plummeted under U.S. bombing. By mid-1945, more than 80% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Even the elite, the Marines, the paratroopers, the Special Naval Landing Forces, were living on ration cuts. Letters from officers to their families spoke of shame, of sending men into battle already half dead. The Japanese government forbade the press from reporting these conditions, but word traveled through the ranks. Starvation was no longer an accident of war. It had become official policy and an unspoken order to die hungry. Meanwhile, the Americans had transformed logistics into art. Every battle became an experiment in efficiency. Cargo ships arrived on exact schedules, marked by color-coded tags for rapid unloading. Aircraft carriers carried not just fighters but bakeries and machine shops. Wherever they went, they laid out infrastructure as if to stay forever. And that permanence broke Japan's psychological resistance even before Hiroshima. In the weeks following Okinawa, intercepted Japanese communications revealed a shift in tone. Reports from field officers were stripped of rhetoric and filled with quiet resignation. Enemy food situation, luxurious. Our men eat roots. Morale impossible to sustain. Men cannot fight on empty stomachs. Even Emperor Hirohito's advisors began to mention supply inferiority as the true enemy. It was a concept alien to Japan's warrior ethos, that victory might not depend on courage or sacrifice, but on the flow of butter, meat, and machinery. But it was true. The war had started with slogans about purity of spirit. It was ending with calories and cold storage. America had proven that war could be industrialized not just in weapons but in comfort. And that comfort, visible, tangible, undeniable, broke morale more effectively than bombs. When Japan's high command received reports of American troops eating steak and ice cream even under fire, some officers refused to believe it. They called it propaganda. But captured prisoners confirmed it again and again. One Japanese naval lieutenant told his interrogators, "Your men eat like officers. Ours die like insects." How can we win such a war? It was not simply a loss of material. It was a collapse of belief. Japan's code of honor had been forged on the notion that suffering was strength. But the Americans had rewritten the meaning of strength itself, to provide, to sustain, to endure indefinitely. That revelation began to echo beyond the battlefield. In Tokyo, the war cabinet started using a new word to describe America. Not just enemy, but producer. An enemy that could replace every bullet, rebuild every base, and feed every man no matter how far from home. It was a new kind of empire, and Japan had no answer to it. By July 1945, when American bombers burned Japan's cities by night and supplied their crews with fresh eggs and milk by morning, the contradiction had become unbearable. Defeat was no longer a theory, and it was a daily hunger. And as Japanese leaders faced the truth, the question changed from how to fight to how much longer their soldiers could even stand. That breaking point, political, human, and logistical, would shape the final days of the empire. And it would reveal the ultimate weapon of the Pacific War, not the bomb but the supply chain. When the war finally reached Japan's home islands, starvation had already defeated the empire before the surrender was signed. By August 1945, millions of civilians were surviving on less than 1,500 calories a day, half of what the human body needs. Famine crept through the countryside like a shadow. Children fainted in schoolyards. Soldiers returning from the Pacific were too weak to stand at attention. The Japanese military had once preached endurance as the nation's sacred virtue. Now even endurance was running out. Factories stopped producing. Trains no longer carried rice. In rural villages, mothers boiled bark to feed their children. Japan's war machine had consumed its own people. The American blockade had worked not through firepower alone, but through mathematics. A silent siege that strangled Japan's ability to feed itself. Oil tankers were sunk faster than they could leave port. Cargo convoys vanished under submarine attack. And as Japan's economy collapsed, so did its military structure. By the summer of 1945, 1 in every 2 Japanese soldiers stationed abroad was malnourished. When Emperor Hirohito recorded his surrender speech on August 15th, he used careful words. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. But those who listened from bombed-out cities knew the truth. The empire had starved to death. After the surrender, Allied forces began a massive investigation into Japan's wartime logistics. What they found was staggering. Entire divisions had fought on a single meal a day. Ships had sailed without enough fuel to return home. Medical units lacked bandages. Hospitals reused surgical tools. Japan's once proud army had been reduced to a skeleton, not by enemy fire but by hunger. The contrast with the American occupation forces could not have been sharper. As U.S. troops landed in Yokohama and Tokyo Bay, they brought food with them, not just for themselves, but eventually for the Japanese civilians too. American field kitchens served bread, milk, and meat under the same skies where Japanese citizens queued for rice rations measured by the spoon. In Tokyo, crowds watched as American soldiers unloaded crates labeled U.S. Army frozen beef. Some Japanese officers wept. The war had been fought under the illusion that spiritual purity could triumph over material wealth, and here was the evidence that the opposite was true. The U.S. military's logistical supremacy became the foundation for the post-war world. It wasn't merely a victory of industry, it was a revelation of system. A system that could move oceans of food, fuel, and machinery faster than Japan could move a single ship. General Douglas MacArthur later called it the triumph of organization over desperation. During the occupation, American economists studied the Japanese supply failures as case studies in modern warfare. They discovered that Japan's logistical doctrine was built around short, decisive wars, not long global campaigns. Once the tide turned, their system imploded. Factories lacked raw materials. Transport networks collapsed under bombing. And their soldiers, isolated on islands, starved silently, cut off from the motherland. By contrast, the U.S. had created something entirely new: logistics as strategy. Every bullet, every ration, every crate of ice cream was part of a deliberate design to sustain human performance indefinitely. That doctrine would shape every future American war, from Korea to Iraq. Historians later summarized it in one phrase: Japan fought with bravery. America fought with breakfast. It was a brutal truth, but it explained everything. Courage alone could no longer win modern wars. The victors were those who could feed courage, fuel it, and transport it across the sea without interruption. By 1946, Japan's people began receiving food shipments from the same nation they had tried to defeat, and in that paradox lay the quiet ending of the Pacific War, not with revenge but with nourishment. The country that had starved its soldiers was now being fed by its enemy. From the ashes of that hunger rose a new Japan, one that would build its post-war identity not on conquest, but on production and efficiency. The same lesson the Americans had demonstrated on the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa now became Japan's own philosophy. Sustainability is survival. And from that realization a generation later, Japan would transform from an empire of scarcity to a nation of industry. But before that transformation came reflection, the final somber understanding of what the war had truly revealed. The Pacific War ended not only with surrender, but with revelation. In the ruins of Tokyo, among the ashes of empire, the world saw what modern conflict had become. It was no longer a duel of warriors. It was a test of systems. For centuries, armies had spoken of courage, sacrifice, and honor. But in the 20th century, those virtues met a new force: organization. The ability to move food, fuel, and hope faster than the enemy could move despair. It was not glory that sustained the American soldier on the beaches of Tarawa or the ridges of Okinawa. It was logistics, the invisible architecture of victory. To the Japanese, this realization came too late. They had believed the human spirit could defy hunger. But hunger, indifferent and silent, became their most merciless opponent. No act of valor could fill an empty stomach. No code of honor could replace a supply convoy sunk beneath the waves. When Japanese soldiers wrote in their final letters that the enemy eats like gods, they were not speaking of envy. They were witnessing the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where power came not from swords or slogans, but from systems that fed millions without pause. And yet within that efficiency lay a moral weight. The same organization that could deliver ice cream to the front lines could also deliver atomic fire to a city. Human mastery of logistics had made us unstoppable, and therefore more dangerous than ever. After the war, the United States studied its success and gave it a name: the Logistics Revolution. But for those who lived through it, Japanese, American, or otherwise, the lesson was simpler, almost human. War, they realized, is not sustained by hate or bravery alone. It is sustained by hunger or its absence. In the Pacific, one nation starved and the other fed. That difference decided history. Today, when we see aircraft carriers as floating cities or soldiers eating hot meals in distant deserts, we are seeing the legacy of that war. The proof that modern power is not about destruction, but endurance. Because in the end, the real victory of the Pacific was not who fought harder, but who never went hungry.